populations like Dominicans and Puerto Ricans disproportionately, but not exclusively. And you can see that borne out in the statistics to bring it full circle on the inmate population, where Blacks are overrepresented but aren't the majority, among people murdered by police officers every year, where Blacks are, again, overrepresented but aren't the majority, among the poor and homeless, where Blacks, again, are overrepresented but one more time don't constitute the majority. And what that does do, and unfortunately, the right is not wrong about this, it functions divisively, right? Because it insists that we triage empathy for each other. And in my youth, that triage of empathy did not extend to Black Americans or Hispanics, right? Because that's the era of underclass ideology. And so nobody cared, what your story was, what your backdrop was. And the Democrats are very clear about this, right? Senator Joe Biden and First Lady Hillary Clinton, were both very clear that whatever the source of super predators, though Joe Biden never used that phrase, he certainly embraced the concept as senator. Whatever the origin story, it doesn't matter because they're here now. And since they're here now, we need mandatory minimums. We need to expand the purview of capital offenses. We need to just lock them up, right? And didn't even give them midnight basketball. But midnight basketball would have been cold comfort anyway, because it wouldn't have addressed the material sources of inequality that impacted Blacks disproportionately, but not exclusively. And I will say that reality translated in part to Blacks' overrepresentation among the inmate population. There is absolutely, positively no question that there were sentencing disparities, particularly drug sentencing disparities, not just between powdered cocaine and crack, which pharmacologically are the same drug, right? So there's no reason to have different punishments for either of them. Even among crack offenders, period, you found sentencing disparities where Blacks were way more likely than whites, when convicted of possession of crack cocaine, to face very stiff sentences, right? So there's no question that those racially informed issues, right, or racism, whatever you want to call it, informed sentencing disparities. But another thing that informed disparities was also the disparities in crime rates, all right, which were much higher among Black Americans. But then if you look a little deeper, if race is the only lens that you have to make sense of these inequalities, then you get super predators. And that, again, is what liberals and conservatives that coalesced around. Then, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2000s. But if you add class to the mix, as I did as a kid, right, because I was really concerned about getting caught up with cops, ultimately for no good reason. But if you add class to the mix, then what you see is Black perpetrators of violent crime and property theft, and white and Hispanic and Asian have something in common. They tended to be poor. And that doesn't mean that poor people are programmed to be criminals. That's absurd. That's what a eugenicist would say. But the inequalities that were rampant by the 80s, for sure, by way of deindustrialization, right? The decline in well-paying, unionized jobs is a shorthand in the deindustrialization in American cities, which impacts Blacks disproportionately because of redlining, et cetera. But that decline of the American working class was a major source of the disparities in crime, right? And one more time for the people in the back, if the only lens that you use to make sense of this is race or racism, then you get super predators. And then you fast forward to where we are, if the only lens that you have to make sense of this is racism, then the non-Black inmates, the non-Black victims of mass incarceration and police murders and that kind of thing, then they don't matter, right? I mean, then we are to assume, this isn't my perspective, I need to be clear about this, we should assume that they just invited this on themselves, right? Because the only lens that we have to make sense of why the US incarcerates more people than any other nation on the globe is racism. So the fact that, let's say, if you just look at the white inmate population in a place like Mississippi, what you're going to find, so we'll just assume that Black incarceration and white incarceration are the same, right? The rates in Mississippi, they're not. Blacks are way more likely to be incarcerated than whites. But if you just focus on the whites for a second, what you're going to find is the U.S. incarcerates more white people than Canada incarcerates human beings, or the UK incarcerates human beings, or France incarcerates, and these human beings are Canadian, Englishmen, Frenchmen, etc. Right? The U.S. incarcerates way more white people than the Western European or Canadian counterparts incarcerate people. We have an incarceration problem that is worse for Blacks. No question about that. No question. But even if you just look at the incarceration rates among whites, there's something wrong in America if we're incarcerating that many people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it naturalizes and reifies the white incarceration to only talk about Black incarceration.
And how is that not going to nurture resentment? Right? I mean, if we live in a democracy, and we do, and we're all in this together, and we don't understand ourselves to be in this together, which is part of the problem. If you ration empathy and compassion, then what you're going to do is nurture animosity, right? And hostility to the issues that we actually might be invested in.